Hey everyone! We're entering the sort of final third of the course. We have 3 more chapters from the textbook that we're going to look at. Chapters 5, Chapters 6, and Chapters 11. And then we're going to also look at something that I'll supplement with you as a PDF. Look at a few of the statistical arguments that we mentioned when we were introducing different kinds of inductive arguments. So that's what the rest of the semester is going to look like. This week we're going to talk about arguments by analogy, which are a particular kind of inductive probative argument. All right, let's get started. So like I just said, analogical arguments are examples of inductive probative arguments. So they're inductive, they don't give us certain conclusions, and they're probative, they only give us good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. There's still the risk of those reasons being defeated if we acquire more evidence in the future. So the basic way to think about how an analogical argument works is that it sort of moves from something that you know pretty well to something that you know less well. So you sort of take advantage of your prior knowledge base to sort of reach new judgments about situations or things you're not as familiar with. So let's just look at a sort of very highly simplistic example. So let's say you've got some sort of mysterious object. All you know about the object is that it's a fruit. You don't know anything else. You don't know what kind of fruit. You don't know where it comes from. Just that it's a fruit. You don't even know what it looks like, in fact. All right, so what are you allowed to sort of guess if you had to guess about the fruit? Well, you've experienced other pieces of fruit before. Maybe you've experienced apples, you've experienced cherries, and those instances of fruit are both sweet. Indeed, most fruits are really quite sweet. So our mystery piece of fruit, it seems as if it would be reasonable to infer by analogy to the other kinds of fruit that you're familiar with that our mystery piece of fruit is also probably sweet. Now, it doesn't have to be true. It could turn out to be the case that our mystery piece of fruit is an avocado, which is not a sweet fruit. But it still was a good example of reasoning. Most likely, it's going to be the case that if I have some mysterious piece of fruit, it'll probably be pretty sweet, based on my past experiences with fruit. When we talk about arguments by analogy, we're going to begin by distinguishing what we're going to call the analogs. So these are the two things that are getting compared. So in the sort of the simple case that I just went through, the two things that are being compared are all of my past experiences with fruit and this current, present mystery fruit that I don't know what it's made of or what it is. Those are the two things that are getting compared. We're going to call those the analogs. So there are a couple different kinds of analogies that we can draw. So the first one we'll look at is what gets called a precedent analogy. Think you're sort of something like a legal precedent. That's sort of the idea here. In a precedent analogy, the suggestion of the analogy, or the way that the analogy works, is by suggesting that our reasoning about a certain situation should be sort of consistent. We should reason the same way in all similar circumstances. And again, that's what the idea of legal precedent, right? If we reached one conclusion in one legal circumstance, we should reach the same conclusion in all similar kind of circumstances. That's called a precedent. So let's just look at an example of this. So a judge so-and-so has ruled that a 2015 law in Washington State violated the Voting Rights Act of 1968. Well, there's a similar bill that's passed in Wyoming in 2017. So we should expect Judge so-and-so to also reject this bill. Indeed, Judge so-and-so should reject this bill for also violating the Voting Rights Act. The structure of the argument is pretty clear, right? If these two bills really are as similar as the argument is saying, we should expect the judge to reach the same conclusion. Next up is what gets called a causal analogy. So with causal analogies, you basically say that similar things are going to cause similar outcomes, or that similar things are going to be caused by similar outcomes. Either direction is fine. And again, let's look at it as an example of these. These are very common. So rat brains and human brains are actually quite similar, at least in certain respects. And so if we developed a drug that cured Alzheimer's in a rat, we should expect that same drug to have the same effect in human beings. And again, of course, this just shows that these are sort of probative inductive arguments, not deductive arguments, because indeed there's been many drugs that have actually proven effective on Alzheimer's in rats that just the transfer didn't work. But nevertheless, you would have good reason to at least hope that there would be a transfer, depending on really just how similar rats' brains and human brains are. There's a sort of a subset of causal arguments that are called historical arguments. It's sort of like a special version. So this is basically any time when you sort of look back upon past events and use what happened in past events to determine what's going to happen in the present. Right? Presumably on the assumption that what was going on in the past is really similar in some respect to what's going on in the present. So again, let's look at an example, one from the beginning of class. So the situation in the nation of Sardinia is a lot like the situation that was found in Serbia in the 1990s. US intervention was pretty successful in Serbia in the 90s, so therefore, because of the similarities between the historical situations, we should expect US intervention in Sardinia to try to prevent human rights abuses or whatnot to also be pretty successful. Again, note how this is working, right? If the cases really are similar, if the historical antecedent is really similar to the present case, it's reasonable to expect that if you do the same thing, you'll get a similar outcome. Alright, so how do we go about evaluating these analogical arguments? Well, fortunately, we'll use the exact same technique regardless of what kind of analogy we're looking at, whether it's a precedent analogy, a causal analogy, or a historical analogy. We'll use the same method in all those cases. So your only concern, and I really do mean this, don't be talking about anything else when you're analyzing an analogical argument. This is all that matters. The only relevant thing is how relevantly similar are the analogs to one another, and are there any relevant dissimilarities between the two analogs that the argument sort of is not revealing or not noticing, not bringing to attention. Note, you're going to have to go beyond what the argument itself says, right? I mean, no one's going to make an analogical argument and point out all the ways that their two analogs are really different. It's just not how people do it, right? You're going to have to use your sort of background knowledge, background information to sort of supply the differences that the argument is neglecting to mention. It's also important to note here that you can sort of compare anything you want, right? Almost any two things you compare are going to be similar in some respects, and almost any two things you compare are going to be dissimilar in other respects. What's going to matter isn't just that you list a bunch of similarities and differences. What's going to matter is how relevant the similarities or dissimilarities are to the matter that's being discussed in the argument. That's what you're actually going to need to look at. And indeed, this is why these are probative in a sense, right? There's going to potentially be disagreement about what is relevant and what is not relevant. You're always going to need to justify why you're saying that some similarity or dissimilarity is relevant in the course of your evaluation. Alright, so let's look at a specific example and then sort of see how we'll apply this method in the course of analyzing an actual argument. So, argument. It is obviously wrong to illegally download movie files off of the internet. It's clearly an instance of stealing, in fact. Why? Because it's clearly an instant stealing if you take a car without compensating the owner for it, and when you download a movie file, you're basically doing the exact same thing. Alright, so we've got an analogical argument. Let's go through the steps to sort of analyze and see how good of an argument we've actually got. So my recommendation is that the first step you should follow, just begin by identifying the two things that are being compared. Make it really explicit. Sometimes when I see people go a little off with these arguments, it's because it doesn't look like they've quite gotten the two things being compared right. In this case, the analogs seem pretty straightforward. We're comparing illegally downloading a movie with stealing a car. Suggesting that those are the things that we're comparing, and we're saying that if stealing the car is wrong, then stealing stealing, quote unquote, right, the movie file is wrong. Alright, next step. What are the relevant similarities between the two analogs that we've identified? And in this case, I think the relevant similarities are, again, pretty straightforward. The argument will usually list at least many of the relevant similarities. Right? The similarity in this case is that when you steal a car, you acquire the car, you take the car from its owner without compensating them for it. When you illegally download the movie file, again, you acquire the file from the owner without paying or compensating the owner for the file. Step 3. Now you have to go beyond what the argument has presented. You might have even already had to have done so in the second step, but by the third step, you certainly are going to have to go beyond what the argument has implied. Right? Now you need to say, okay, what are the relevant dissimilarities, if any, between the cases being considered as the analogs? And in this case, I think there is a very relevant dissimilarity. When you steal a car, you deprive the owner of the car of use of it. The owner can no longer use the car. When you illegally download a movie file, you actually don't deprive the owner of use of the original file. You make a copy of it. And so that is indeed a relevant difference between the two cases. Last step, you have to say what matters more. And here's where you're basically going to have to do the work, right? What's more relevant? What's more pertinent? And I'm not going to answer that question. I actually think this is indeed a very interesting moral question. At least the way people normally, throughout history, talked about why stealing is wrong, is that it deprives someone of the use of something. And that's not really relevant in this case, but that doesn't mean that that's we were right to always talk that way, right? Maybe there is indeed something really importantly wrong and problematic simply about taking advantage of someone else's work without compensating them for it, regardless of whether or not you sort of deprive them of the ability to take advantage of the object themselves. All right, so I've said that when you're analyzing these analogical arguments, you're going to have to supply outside information that's not present in the argument itself, in the course of evaluating them. But what happens if you actually don't know a lot about a topic being considered? It seems like you won't be able to sort of bring up the relevant kinds of background information that are necessary to really evaluate the argument. In those cases, there's another option. You've got another possible way you can answer one of these questions. If you've got an argument that you just are not really familiar with either of the two analogs, so you can't really talk about how relevantly similar or dissimilar they are, what you can do instead is indicate that you need more information and then go through an exhaustive and really careful and detailed list of both what information you would need and why you would need it. So this isn't less work. Saying I don't know is actually you need to do, it's almost even more work in a sense. You need to say what would you need to know and why would it matter. So again, let's look at a sort of example. So this is an argument that, I specialize in ancient philosophy, so I actually do indeed know quite a bit about the fall of the Roman Empire. My guess is many of you don't, though, and so you're going to need some additional information. So consider this argument. The situation in the Roman Empire right before its collapse is very similar to the situation in the United States today. Therefore, we should suspect that if things don't change in the United States will collapse soon, just as the Roman Empire did. Now, again, I know a fair amount about the Roman Empire. I can sort of say what similarities exist between the late Roman Empire and the current day United States. Most of you probably don't. You just probably haven't really studied that carefully. Here's how you'd go about answering this question. You'd list examples of the kinds of information you would need to know to say how relevantly similar or how relevantly dissimilar the analogs actually are, right? So you'd need to know things like, for example, what was the actual situation like when Rome fell versus how does that compare to the situation today? Maybe you'd want to know things like, were there instances of nations in similar conditions to Rome where that nation didn't collapse historically? Do we have historical counterexamples, maybe, to the analogy? Maybe you'll want to know, does the fall of Rome have anything to do with its sort of technological level? Because you can guess there's a pretty big technological difference between the United States and ancient Rome. Right? Things of that sort, and then you need to explain why those things are relevant, right? Because all of those issues are going to sort of bear relevance to how likely it is that the United States is going to collapse for the same sort of causal reasons that the Roman Empire collapsed. All right, that'll do it for this week. So study up on these arguments by analogy. We're not going to have an exam this week. There's another part of Chapter 5 where we'll look at causal arguments. We'll do that next week, and then have an exam on both of the two parts of Chapter 5. All right, so I will see you all soon. Hope you're doing well. Bye!